In this video, we're going to take a deep dive into the incredible final round of the 2025 Norway chess tournament. Before the start of the last round, Magnus Carlsen was leading the tournament, but only by half a point. Right behind him was Gukesh Darmaraju, the reigning world champion. Hikaru Nakamura had already drawn his game in this round, which meant he was no longer in contention for first place. So now, the only players left fighting for the title: Fabiano Caruana, Gukesh, and of course, Magnus Carlsen. Magnus is playing against Arjun Erigaisi, while Fabiano faces none other than Gukesh himself. It's in these two games that the champion of Norway Chess 2025 will be decided. Let's jump into the game. Arjun has the white pieces, Magnus is playing black. The game begins with d4. We'll follow it from Magnus's point of view. He replies with d5, and then comes c4, the queen's gambit. But Magnus declines the gambit and strengthens his center. White develops the knight to c3, and Magnus plays f6. After a trade on d5, White's bishop jumps out to g5, threatening the capture on f6. If Black recaptures with the queen, the pawn on d5 would fall. Magnus blocks the pin with e7. White plays e3, preparing to develop the light-squared bishop. After Magnus castles, the bishop goes to d3. Then h6, a common move, pushing back the dark-squared bishop and giving the king some air. The bishop retreats to h4, and now c6 for Magnus, reinforcing the center and preparing b5 in the future. White places the knight on e2, not f3, because this structure usually supports an upcoming f3, followed by e4, a powerful central push. Magnus develops his knight. White castles, then a5 for Magnus, a slight deviation from theory. White begins their plan with f3, supporting e4. Magnus responds with queenside play, preparing b4. If White pushes e4 too soon, they might lose central control. White plays c2, adding pressure to the e4 square. Magnus plays e8, getting the rook on the open file, where everything will soon explode. And there it is, e4. White strikes the center. They're looking to follow up with e5, closing in on Magnus's position. Magnus must act quickly. He plays b4, pushing away the knight. After the knight retreats, pressure on e4 is reduced. A pawn trade happens in the center, and then Magnus uncorks a tactic. e4. It looks like a piece sacrifice, but it's a trap. If White captures the knight, they lose the unprotected bishop on h4. That's the entire point behind Magnus's combination. Magnus expected Arjun to recapture with the queen on c6, but Arjun plays even more creatively. First e7, attacking the queen. Black is forced to capture, and only then does Arjun play c6. And now, things start going off script for Magnus. He recovers the pawn, and material is equal, but now the rook on a8 is hanging. If Magnus moves it, say to b8, he walks into tactical danger. For example, White sacrifices a rook with f7, and it cannot be taken. If Black captures with the queen, c4 pins the queen. If the king takes, again c4, and a brutal mating attack begins. Magnus doesn't want any of that. Instead of saving the rook, he allows it to be captured. He plays f6, letting Arjun take on a8, which he does. Then e3, a double attack, check, and hitting the bishop on d3. The king steps away and Magnus captures on d3. Another white piece is now under fire. White plays knight f4, attacking the queen. Arjun is wondering, will Magnus take the pawn on d4 and activate his last inactive piece? Despite the risk, Magnus grabs the d4 pawn. So now, in exchange for the rook on a1, Magnus has a bishop on c8 and a pawn on f7. White plays d1, kicking the queen. Magnus chooses e5, but this is slightly inaccurate. White plays c1 and Magnus must defend. f8, cutting off checks along the back rank. White grabs the c8 bishop. Now Magnus continues with f4, another tactical idea. If White captures, they're mated on the first rank due to their exposed king. Now it's White who must find the only move to stay alive. Their rook on f1 is hanging, and so is the back rank. If they try to play e8, they don't make it in time. Any move with the rook fails. Magnus sacrifices the queen and wins the rook anyway. Let's say d1, then c8 recaptures, and the knight on f8 guards everything. Then g4, threatening h2 and a fork on f2. There's simply no defense. Even g3 doesn't help. f3, and another elegant checkmate follows. White's only move? a6, pinning the knight, stopping the threats. Magnus can't take the c8 rook now, because if he does, White first trades queens, then recaptures. Magnus loses the attack, so instead he sacrifices the queen, f1, and then captures c8. Now Magnus has traded his queen for a knight on f8, a rook on c8, not full compensation, but enough to try for a draw. That's all Magnus needs, a draw. because if Gukesh doesn't beat Fabiano, Magnus wins the tournament anyway. White plays h2, giving their king Luft. Magnus posts the rook to d5, building a fortress. White's plan now is to eat the queenside pawns, a5, b4, and push the passed pawns. But Magnus positions his rook defensively on d5, well supported by the knight. White's knight finally enters the game, c4, targeting a5. Magnus must act, or lose the pawn chain. He activates the knight, e6, going all in on the king attack. White takes on a5, and now Magnus begins the assault. g5. He's banking on his pieces being more active in an attack than White's queenside pawns. White's knight returns to the center, c4, controlling key squares. But now Magnus plays g4, and this pawn can't be captured. If White takes, they weaken the first rank and g4 takes over, covering f2 and h2. So White ignores it and plays b3, stabilizing the knight, but then comes h3, and Magnus finally gets a weakness to target, h5, pinning down the pawn. White plays h2, but this weakens their king even more. Better would have been g2, avoiding pins. Magnus, like a true predator, plays g7, reinforcing the knight and preparing g5. White plays b7, multifunctional, attacks b4, covers the king, and eyes f7. Magnus plays g5, launching a counterattack. White plays d6. Now the position is finally equalized. f7 is covered by the knight, and black has no breakthrough. Still, Magnus grabs h3, and White goes g2. Wrote d3, kicking the knight, and White plays f5. g6, then e7. White is ready for a perpetual. If g7, then f5 again, but Magnus wants more. h5, going face-to-face with the White king. Arjun grabs on b4, a mistake, trying to create a passed pawn. Now Magnus plays e4, centralizing his knights. If White pushes the pawn now, they lose. d2 traps the king. For example, f1, g3, and f3, a clean finish. White must play f1 early to avoid the mating net. Still, Magnus cuts off the king with d2, a deadly bind. He's threatening g3, then f3. White plays b5, trying to pin the knight. Now Magnus had a winning move, f5, blocking the pin and preparing the final blow, but he doesn't find it. Instead, he plays road d1, trying to milk time, g2, d2, f1. White is holding on for dear life. Magnus isn't satisfied. g4, releasing the pin. f5, g3, e5, f3, f5, g3, e3, d5, d4. Now comes a fork threat. White plays e1, dodging it. Magnus has 36 seconds on the clock. Arjun, over 8 minutes. The winning move here was h2, and then h1 with a fork. But Magnus plays a2 instead, grabbing a pawn, missing the win, d7, and now White threatens b5 plus to take the rook. Magnus gives a check. a1, e2, then back, a2. The position repeats. The game ends in a draw. Why? Because Magnus saw the other board. Gukesh was losing. Even if Fabiano wins, a draw secures first place for Magnus Carlsen, and that's exactly what happens. Gukesh loses to Caruana, and Magnus Carlsen becomes the Norway Chess 2025 champion for the 7th time. A spectacular game full of tactics, blunders, and world-class calculation. Magnus showed resilience, courage, and sharp instincts. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this analysis, leave a like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.